A concert ticket, face value 60 currency units. You did not get one, so you go online and the same ticket, same seat, same show is now selling for 600. Nothing about the ticket changed. The paper is identical. So where did that extra 540 come from?
That is the question that apparently kept one very broke, very stubborn German philosopher up at night for the better part of 2 decades.
His name was Karl Marx. Chain smoking, constantly in debt, writing by gaslight in a cramped London flat, bankrolled for years by his friend Friedrich Engels just so he could keep working instead of getting a real job. And the book he eventually finished, Does Capital, has been called the most influential work of economics ever written. Also the most banned, the most worshipped, and the most wildly misunderstood book of the last 2 centuries.
And he does not open it with revolution. No storming palaces, no manifestos.
He opens it with an object, something sitting in your kitchen, your closet, your bag right now. A commodity. Because if you want to crack open something as massive as an entire economic system, you do not start at the top with billionaires and stock exchanges. You start with its smallest living cell, and you cut it open under a microscope.
So start cutting. What actually is a commodity in his sense, not just, a product on a shelf.
A commodity is anything made specifically to be sold, not used by the person who made it. And Marx says every single one is secretly two things stitched together wearing one skin. Use value and exchange value. Use value is simple. What does the thing actually do for you? A coat keeps you warm. A ticket gets you into the venue. That part depends entirely on its physical properties. Exchange value is the weird one. It is the ratio at which a thing trades for something else entirely unrelated. Your $60 ticket for $600 in cash, a coat for 20 yards of linen, a bicycle for a stack of currency notes. None of these things share a single physical property. One keeps you warm, one gets you into a stadium, one is numbers on a screen, and yet the market calmly declares them equal. As if hiding underneath all that obvious difference, there is some common substance they all secretly share, just in different amounts.
So what is it? What is the hidden substance?
Marx interrogates the ticket, so to speak, like a detective. It cannot be usefulness itself, because use values do not compare. You cannot say a concert is worth 3 loaves of bread in terms of joy versus calories. So he strips away every specific quality, one at a time, until only one thing is left standing. Human labor, effort and time poured into making the thing exist at all.
Congealed labor. That phrase always floats away from me a little. Ground it.
Picture the reseller. They did not build a stage or hire a band. What they are actually selling is scarcity itself, cornered and repackaged. But the underlying ticket, the physical printing, the venue staff, the sound engineers, the security team, the years the artists spent writing songs no one wanted to hear yet. That is where the real labor sits. Now picture two people doing the same job differently. Two scalpers, if you like. One manually refreshes a ticket site for 6 hours straight. The other has a bot script that grabs 200 tickets in 6 seconds.
Is the slow one working 600 times harder for the same result?
He is working harder, sure, but the market does not pay for his personal grind. It pays for what Marx calls socially necessary labor time, the average effort it takes society at its current level of technology to get that result. The manual scalper is not creating more value by suffering longer. He is just less efficient. Value is set at the social level, not the individual one.
That lands uncomfortably close to home for anyone who has ever worked a piece-rate job, or freelanced, or driven for an app at 2 in the morning.
It should land close to home. The market has never once rewarded you extra for simply being slower, however hard you actually worked. There is a second distinction hiding inside this one. Concrete labor versus abstract labor. Concrete labor is the specific craft. Coding differs from carpentry, differs from farming in real physical skill and motion. Abstract labor strips all of that away. It is just human energy spent, muscle, nerve, and brain, measured as an interchangeable quantity.
Make that physical for me.
Picture a software engineer and an electrician on the same construction project. wiring smart locks into a new building. Concretely, their work looks nothing alike. One writes code, one strips wire. But abstractly, from the market's point of view selling the finished building, both simply spent a quantity of generic human labor time, time that could have gone into a different job entirely. Capitalism, Marx argues, is the first system in history to treat labor this way by default, as an interchangeable, tradable quantity, rather than a specific craft belonging to a specific person, embedded in a specific community.
Is that actually new, historically? Did earlier societies really not think this way?
Under European feudalism, a serf owed labor directly to a lord, 3 days a week on the lord's fields, bound by custom and status, never converted into an hourly wage. Guild systems were just as concrete. A master shoemaker's decade of training was not interchangeable with a master baker's. Labor only becomes a tradable, abstract commodity once industrial capitalism takes hold across England from the 1700s onward.
And that is where the land grabs come in, right? The enclosures.
Exactly, and it was not gentle. From the 1500s through the 1800s, common land that peasant families had farmed for generations got fenced off by parliamentary act after parliamentary act, mostly to make room for sheep and the wool trade. Families with no legal claim streamed into Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, with nothing left to sell except their own capacity to work. Marx calls this primitive accumulation, a violent historical precondition, not a peaceful evolution. For the abstract labor market we now treat as simply how things are.
That is uncomfortable, because most of us just accept that of course you sell your labor by the hour. It feels like weather. Like it was always going to be this way.
And that feeling of inevitability is exactly the illusion Marx spends the whole book dismantling. Nothing about selling abstract hours of your one finite life for a wage is natural. It had to be built, often through violence and dispossession, and then made to feel invisible, boring, obvious.
Bring it fully into today, though. Does any of this survive into a gig economy world?
It survives almost too cleanly. Think about a rideshare driver. What gets sold is not this specific driver's charm or this specific conversation. The app abstracts the labor into interchangeable units, minutes driven, miles logged, a rating out of 5 that flattens an actual human life into a number. Two drivers with completely different stories become directly comparable, exactly the way Marx describes a shoemaker and a baker becoming comparable through abstract labor. The pricing algorithm is, whether its engineers intend this or not, a machine for calculating socially necessary labor time in real-time traffic.
That is a slightly unsettling way to describe checking a fare estimate on your phone before you order the ride.
It should be a little unsettling. Marx is not writing a dry textbook. He is trying to make the totally ordinary, totally invisible machinery of daily economic life suddenly look strange again, so you stop mistaking it for simple, neutral fact.
So, quick recap before we go further. Every commodity is two things stitched together: use value and exchange value. Underneath exchange value sits abstract labor, measured not by personal effort but by socially necessary labor time. And treating labor as an abstract, sellable quantity is not eternal or natural. It is a specific historical product, born violently out of enclosure-era England.
Exactly right. And notice the one thing we still have not explained: how this hidden value actually shows up, gets measured, becomes visible in the real world through prices, through money. We have found the substance. Next we need its form. And that leads to the strangest, most quoted turn in the entire book: why an ordinary object like a resale ticket or a table starts behaving as though it has a mind and a will of its own the moment it enters the marketplace.
An object with a mind of its own. That sounds like folklore, not economics.
Marx uses almost exactly that comparison. Tables standing on their heads and dancing. Stay with us for part 2. Quick question. That $50 bill in your wallet, why is it worth anything at all? It is a rectangle of cotton and linen with some green ink on it. You cannot eat it, wear it, or build with it. So why does a stranger hand you groceries for it?
Last time we found the hidden substance behind value, congealed human labor, measured in socially necessary labor time. But that does not explain the $50 bill.
Exactly. Nobody stands at a checkout with a stopwatch calculating labor hours before buying a shirt. We just glance at a price tag. So Marx has to explain how an invisible substance, labor time, turns into something as visible and dumb as a number on a receipt. He calls this the form of value, and he insists on building it up in stages, almost frame by frame, because he thinks jumping straight to money hides something important.
So start at frame 1.
Frame 1, the simplest possible case. 20 yards of linen equals one coat. That is it. One thing measured against exactly one other thing. Notice something strange already. The linen is active. It is the thing trying to express its worth, while the coat just sits there passively as the measuring stick. You cannot say linen is worth linen. That tells you nothing. It needs a mirror, something else to reflect its value back at it, the way you need a mirror to actually see your own face.
That sounds almost too trivial to bother analyzing.
It feels trivial because we already live at the endpoint money and forget this mirror relationship had to be built up historically, painfully, piece by piece. Picture ancient Mesopotamia. You have cattle. You want grain. You need to find someone who has grain and specifically wants cattle right now at the same time you do. Economists call that the double coincidence of wants, and it is a genuine headache. One-to-one barter works, but clumsily.
So the next move has to be solving that headache.
Right, frame 2, the expanded form. Instead of linen measured against one thing, now measure it against many things at once. 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or a quarter of wheat, or 2 ounces of gold. More flexibility, more trading partners. But now you have a new problem. The list never ends, and every trader is running their own separate, overlapping chain of comparisons. Still no single shared ruler everyone agrees on.
And this is where it stops being logic and becomes actual history.
It really does, and the history here is one of my favorite rabbit holes in the entire chapter, because the answers are wildly different across civilizations. Frame 3, the general form, one single commodity that an entire community agrees to use as the universal mirror. Cattle did this job across ancient Indo-European societies, so thoroughly that our word capital comes from the Latin caput, meaning head, as in head of cattle. Cowrie shells did it across Africa, South Asia, and the Pacific for centuries. Salt did it in ancient Rome. Soldiers were partly paid in it, which is exactly where the word salary comes from.
Here is one you can actually use at a dinner party: the island of Yap.
This is genuinely one of the strangest true stories in monetary history, and worth sharing with literally anyone who thinks money has to be something you can hold. On Yap in the Pacific, wealth was measured in giant carved stone discs called rye stones, some the size of a car, far too heavy to move. Ownership just changed hands by public agreement while the stone itself stayed put. And here is the part that breaks people's brains. One famous stone was lost at sea during transport centuries ago, sank straight to the ocean floor, never seen again. The community simply agreed it still counted. To this day, economists cite that sunken stone as real, functioning currency, backed by nothing but collective memory and trust.
That is basically a blockchain ledger with extra steps, and it predates blockchain by centuries.
Genuinely, yes. Eventually, across most large trading civilizations, one particular kind of commodity won out for entirely physical reasons. Gold does not rot or rust. You can divide it into smaller units without losing value, unlike a cow, which stops being two cows if you cut it in half. It is portable and it is naturally scarce, hard to fake. Once gold becomes the universal mirror, you get frame 4, money proper. And Marx's real point, the one people miss, is that money is not some abstract thing floating above ordinary objects. It is a commodity, gold, historically, that got promoted by social custom into one very specific job.
Bring it to paper, though, because a $20 bill is obviously a big jump from a chunk of metal you can bite to test.
Huge jump, and this is where it gets genuinely wild. Paper money started as a receipt, a claim ticket redeemable for an actual weight of gold sitting in a vault. That was the gold standard. Then in 1971, President Nixon severed the dollar from gold completely, live on television, an event now called the Nixon shock. Since that afternoon, the money in your pocket is fiat currency, valuable purely because a government says so and enough people believe it.
That sounds shockingly fragile when you say it out loud.
It can be. In Weimar Germany in the early 1920s, hyperinflation got so extreme that burning banknotes for heat was cheaper than buying firewood with them. And there are documented cases of people literally wallpapering rooms with worthless currency because it was cheaper than actual wallpaper. Workers got paid twice a day because prices could double by lunchtime. In Zimbabwe in the 2000s, the government printed a single note worth 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, and it could barely buy a bus ticket.
And somewhere in here cryptocurrency has to show up.
It fits with almost eerie precision. Bitcoin tries to recreate gold's old scarcity trick, a fixed supply nobody can print more of on a whim but with zero physical backing, just cryptographic proof and a distributed ledger a decentralized network maintains together. Here is the detail that always gets a reaction. The person who invented Bitcoin, using the name Satoshi Nakamoto, has never been identified. Not by journalists, not by governments, not by anyone. Billions of dollars in value, built entirely on trust in a protocol designed by someone whose real identity remains completely unknown.
So we have gone from cattle to sunken stones to gold to a mystery person's cryptographic code, all doing the exact same job.
The exact same job, acting as the universal mirror that makes wildly different things comparable. And once a commodity gets a price this way, something strange starts happening to how people perceive it. It starts to seem like it simply has value on its own, intrinsically, magically, the way it has weight. We forget entirely that real human labor put that value there. Marx has a name for this trick of perception, and it might be the single most famous idea in the whole book. Commodity fetishism. That is exactly where we are headed next. Here is a strange experiment. Pick up your phone right now and look at it. Really look at it. Does it feel like it just has value, sitting there in your hand the way it has weight? Most people would say yes. That feeling is exactly what we are about to take apart.
We ended last time on a cliffhanger, a table that starts to seem magical. So earn that claim.
Let us earn it properly, because this idea, commodity fetishism, is genuinely one of the strangest and most powerful ideas in the whole of Does Capital, and it gets misunderstood constantly.
Start with the word itself. Fetishism sounds like anthropology, not economics.
That is exactly where Marx deliberately steals it from. In 19th century anthropological writing, a fetish was an object, carved wood or stone, that a community treated as though it held its own independent spiritual power, even though everyone knew human hands had carved it. The power seems to live inside the object itself, rather than being something people collectively projected onto it.
And Marx says something structurally identical happens with ordinary commodities under capitalism.
Precisely that. Take your phone. Real people in a real factory spent real hours of their one finite life assembling it. That labor, that actual human relationship between the worker and the material, is what creates its value. But the moment it gets a price tag, something flips. The phone appears to simply have value as an inherent property, the way it has weight or a screen size. We stop seeing the worker entirely. We just see an object with a price, as natural and built-in as its color.
So the social relationship, worker to buyer, gets hidden, replaced by what looks like a relationship between two objects instead, the phone and the money.
That is Marx's exact move, and it is the crux of the whole idea. The social relations between people, the miner, the factory worker, the shipping company, the buyer, all get disguised as relations between things. We say the phone is worth a certain number of currency units, as if that were simply a fact about the object, rather than a frozen trace of a whole web of human labor hidden underneath it.
Marx has that wonderfully strange line about tables dancing, does he not?
He does, and it is worth pausing on, because it is such a deliberately odd, almost comic image for such a serious economist to reach for. He describes a table becoming a commodity as though it starts standing on its head and dancing, evolving whimsical ideas out of its own wooden brain. He is being funny on purpose, because he wants you to feel how bizarre this everyday phenomenon actually is, once you stop treating it as boringly normal.
Bring it fully into today, though, with something people actually own.
Here is one worth sharing at your next dinner party. Almost every smartphone on Earth contains materials pulled from around 70 different elements on the periodic table. Cobalt, lithium, rare earth metals, gold, tantalum, all mined, processed, and assembled across dozens of countries before they ever meet in your hand. And none of that is visible when you unbox a phone in sleek, minimalist packaging. You see a logo and a price that feels self-evidently justified by how good the technology is.
That is the fetishism operating in real time, then. The actual human and material story, buried under the branding and the price.
Exactly, and Marx would say this is not just clever advertising. It is baked into how commodity exchange fundamentally works. Advertising simply intensifies a mystification that was already structurally present.
Push on the history, though. Is this a uniquely capitalist evil, or did earlier systems hide labor too?
Genuinely important complication. Marx is careful here. Commodity fetishism is specifically tied to a society where market exchange has become the dominant, generalized way of organizing life, not the exception. In a small self-sufficient household, producing mostly for its own use, there is far less mystification because everyone's labor is nakedly visible. Feudal relationships were often brutally exploitative, but at least transparent about their domination. A serf knew exactly who their lord was and exactly what was owed. There was no price mechanism hiding that relationship. It is specifically the sprawling, anonymous, global market that produces fetishism as a systematic feature, not an occasional personal illusion.
So it is not that earlier societies were more honest. It is that concealment becomes structurally necessary once the market goes fully global.
Precisely. And it is worth being fair to the other side of this argument too. Mainstream economics since the late 1800s largely rejects Marx's labor theory of value entirely, arguing value comes from subjective consumer preference and marginal utility, how much satisfaction the next unit of a good gives a specific buyer, not from objective labor time. Under that view, a cleverly designed, well-branded product genuinely can be worth more than an identical unbranded one, not because of mystification, but because design and trust are themselves real, legitimate sources of value. Marx disagrees fundamentally, but that fault line has been argued over for more than a century, and reasonable economists still land on very different sides of it today.
Good, honest place to leave that tension, sitting rather than pretending Marx simply won.
Agreed. And that sets up our next part perfectly, where fetishism turns out to run far deeper than most people assume, all the way into how you think about your own labor, your own time, even yourself. Here is an uncomfortable one to sit with. When was the last time you described yourself, out loud or on a resume, as a bundle of skills and metrics rather than just a person? Because if you have done that recently, you have already lived the next idea firsthand.
Before we move toward synthesis, there is a deeper layer of commodity fetishism worth digging into. Most people stop at the surface version, prices hide labor. Marx is making a stranger, more unsettling claim.
He is not simply saying people get tricked or fooled. He is saying the illusion is objectively built into how a market economy functions, no matter how smart or informed you personally are.
What is the actual difference there? If people misperceive something, is that not just being tricked?
Here is the nuance. An economics professor who fully understands the labor theory of value, who can teach commodity fetishism perfectly in a lecture hall, still has to walk into an actual store afterward and treat prices as simply given facts. Because that is genuinely how a vast, anonymous global economy has to coordinate itself at scale. Nobody can personally trace the labor history of every apple, every shirt, every phone they buy. The system requires that abstraction just to function at all.
So it is less a personal failure of insight, and more the operating logic of the whole machine.
Exactly, and that is why the Hungarian philosopher Georg Lukács, writing in the early 1920s, extended this into what he called reification. Social relationships between people start to appear, and in a real sense actually function as relationships between things. It spreads far beyond prices, into how people experience their own labor, their own time, even their own personality, as though these were external objects to buy, sell, and measure, rather than lived human activity.
Does that reach all the way into how people think about themselves?
Remarkably far, actually. Think about how casually people today talk about personal branding, building your brand, treating your own personality, your sleep schedule, your morning routine, as an asset to optimize. A job seeker gets coached to present themselves less as a specific person with a specific history, and more as a set of keywords matched against a resume scanning algorithm. That is reification operating on the self. A living person increasingly experienced, sometimes even by themselves, as a commodity with a price, rather than an irreducible human being with a name and a story.
Anchor that in real economic history, though, before it drifts too abstract.
Good instinct. Here is one worth telling people at a party, because most have no idea it is true. For most of the 20th century, one single advertising campaign convinced enormous portions of the world that a diamond engagement ring was simply, naturally, an essential expression of lasting love. That campaign, run by the De Beers Company starting in the 1930s, is the reason engagement rings became a near universal expectation across cultures that never used them before. And here is the part that should genuinely bother you. Diamonds are nowhere near as geologically rare as decades of marketing implied. De Beers spent decades deliberately controlling global supply to keep prices artificially inflated. And during the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Angola in the 1990s, a portion of the stones moving through the global market were what became known as blood diamonds, mined under forced labor to fund brutal armed conflicts. None of that history is visible in a glittering stone sitting in a velvet box under a spotlight. It simply looks like it always, naturally, possessed romantic worth.
That is exactly the mechanism we described with the phone and the table, just wearing a tuxedo.
Precisely, and to be fair, the industry has changed since those darkest decades. Certification schemes were introduced in direct response to the blood diamond scandals, though how effective they actually are remains genuinely debated among researchers. But the deeper structural point survives regardless. Price obscuring labor and human cost is built into commodity exchange itself, not just into one dramatic industry.
Push this into finance, then, because fetishism has to get even stranger once you leave physical objects behind entirely.
This is where Marx himself pushes the concept to its most extreme form, fictitious capital. Company shares, bonds, and far more exotic derivatives appear to generate money simply by existing, simply by being traded, seemingly detached from any underlying labor at all. A share of stock seems to have its own independent life, rising and falling on sentiment and speculation.
The 2008 financial crisis is the obvious modern example here.
It fits with striking precision, and here is a detail worth repeating to almost anyone. At the peak of the mortgage bubble, a single home mortgage could get sliced up, repackaged, and resold inside more than 100 different financial products simultaneously, each one seemingly generating fresh profit through pure financial maneuvering. The actual underlying reality, millions of ordinary mortgages, many issued to borrowers who could never realistically sustain the payments, grew completely disconnected from the soaring valuations built on top of them. When those mortgages started defaulting around 2007, the entire fictitious structure collapsed, revealing that all that apparent wealth had always rested on real, concrete debts owed by real, concrete working people.
That is a genuinely sobering way to think about a crisis a lot of us lived through.
It is, and importantly, Marx is not writing this to induce despair. He believes that once you actually see the mechanism clearly, once the table, the phone, the diamond, the mortgage bond stops looking magical and starts looking like exactly what it is, congealed human labor wearing a disguise, you are equipped to ask sharper, more honest questions about how the whole system might be organized differently.
Which brings us, appropriately, to pulling everything together.
Exactly right, let us do that now. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone who has heard of Does Capital. Marx only ever finished writing one of its 3 volumes. The other 2 were stitched together after his death by Friedrich Engels, working from a chaotic pile of unfinished drafts and notebooks Marx left behind. The most influential economics book of the last 2 centuries was, in a very real sense, never actually completed by its own author.
That is a strange note to open our final part on, but let us pull everything together, because we have covered a genuinely large amount of ground.
Let us do that. We started with a simple observation. Every commodity has 2 faces: use value, its actual physical usefulness, and exchange value, the ratio at which it trades against other things. We asked what could possibly make radically different objects comparable at all, and found, following Marx, that the hidden substance is abstract human labor, specifically socially necessary labor time. Not your personal effort, the social average.
Then we asked how that hidden substance actually becomes visible in everyday life.
Which took us through the value form, from simple barter between 2 things, through many possible trading partners, through one commodity like cattle or salt or a sunken stone becoming the universal mirror for an entire community, to money, where precious metals and eventually digital currency take over that job globally. Money is not separate from ordinary commodities. It is itself a commodity that history promoted into a very specific social role.
And then, once value had a visible price attached to it, something strange happened to how people perceived commodities altogether.
Commodity fetishism. The idea that once a phone, a diamond, a share of stock enters the marketplace and gets a price, we stop seeing the real human labor that produced it and instead perceive the object as though it simply, naturally possesses value on its own. The social relationship between people gets disguised as a relationship between things. And we saw, through the diamond trade, through the 2008 crisis, through how people market themselves for jobs today, that this is not some quaint 19th century curiosity. It is arguably more intense and more globally stretched out today than Marx could have imagined writing by gaslight in a cramped London flat in the 1860s.
Let us be honest about the limits and controversies here too, because we have flagged a few along the way. And this should not sound like Marx simply settled every question forever.
Fair and worth saying plainly. The labor theory of value underlying this whole chapter has been seriously challenged by mainstream economics since the late 1800s, first by marginalist economists like William Stanley Jevons and Carl Menger, who argued value comes from subjective consumer preference, not objective labor time. That marginalist framework has dominated most economics departments worldwide for well over a century. There is also a long-running technical argument, sometimes called the transformation problem, over whether Marx's own mathematics actually succeeds in converting labor values into real market prices consistently. Serious economists on both sides have argued over that one for more than 100 years without full resolution.
So this is a live, contested body of theory, not a settled textbook fact, however influential it remains.
Exactly, and that is precisely why Marx stays such a strange, dual figure in intellectual history. To some, a rigorous economist whose core insight about labor and mystification still cuts remarkably close to how modern global capitalism actually functions. To others, a flawed 19th century theorist whose central value theory has been superseded by more mathematically elegant models. The honest position, and the one we will keep taking through this series, is that his descriptive insight into how commodities disguise the human relationships behind them remains genuinely powerful, even for people who ultimately reject his full technical apparatus.
So where does this leave a listener at the end of Chapter 1? What should someone actually walk away holding on to?
Simply this: the next time you pick up an object, any object, a coffee mug, a phone, a pair of shoes, try to actually see through it for a moment. Back to the hands that made it, the mine it was pulled from, the ship that carried it, the person standing at a machine for 8, 10, 12 hours to produce it. That act of seeing through the price tag to the human labor underneath it is, in miniature, the entire intellectual project of Does Capital. And here is one last thing worth remembering and sharing. Marx died in 1883, largely broke, mourned by barely a dozen people at his funeral in London. His gravestone in Highgate Cemetery, added decades later, simply reads that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. A single sentence that has outlived empires.
And that relationship, buying and selling labor power itself as a commodity, is where Chapter 2 picks up, I take it.
Exactly right. We have spent this whole episode inside the commodity as an object sitting on a shelf. Next time, we follow Marx as he asks his next, genuinely unsettling question. What happens when a very particular commodity, the capacity to work itself, gets bought and sold on the market, and why Marx thinks that single transaction is the hidden engine underneath the entire capitalist system's ability to expand and grow.
A cliffhanger with real teeth, then.
That is rather the point. Thank you for staying with us through Chapter 1 of Does Capital. We will see you next time for Chapter